I have spent my life thinking about light, not the warm light of a lamp, not the light that tells you where the door is in the dark light that travels across the universe. The light that carries the fact of things that happened a billion years ago. That light, and the more I looked at it, the less I understood. If it is not a confession of failure, if that is the beginning of everything. When I was a young man, I had a question that would not leave me. I was 16 years old. He imagined what it would be like to chase a beam of light, not metaphorically. Would I see if I could travel alongside it? If I ran next to a wave in the ocean, the wave would look still. It would just sit there. So what would happen to a beam of light? Would it also sit still? Would it become a frozen, vibrating electromagnetic field, suspended in space? I could not answer that, and that inability to answer it was not a small discomfort. It was a crack in the flow of physics of the time. Was confident light was a wave that had been settled. Maxwell had written down the equations. They were beautifully predicted exactly how light should behave, and in those equations was a number, a speed of light, 300 million meters per second. That number fell out of the mathematics like a stone falling from a tablet clean in a vessel. There was a problem no one wanted to say out loud. The equations did not say whose speed it was. Velocity requires a reference. This is not philosophy. This is geometry. When you say something is moving, you mean it is moving relative to something else. See, a train moves at 100 kilometers per hour relative to the ground, relative to the passenger sitting inside. It is not moving at all. This is obvious. This is unavoidably so. When Maxwell's equations produced this specific speed for light, a reasonable person asked, relative to what? The answer most physicists accepted was, relative to the earth. Ether was an invisible medium filling all of space. Light traveled through it the way sound travels through air. So the speed of light was the speed relative to that medium. Simplification. 1887. Michelson and Morley built an instrument. They wanted to detect the ether if the Earth moves through the ether as it orbits the Sun. Then light traveling in the direction of Earth's motion should appear to go slightly faster than light traveling perpendicular to a difference would be small but measurable. They measured it. They found nothing, no difference. And they repeated the experiment, still nothing. This result was so disturbing that most physicists spent the next decade explaining it away. Perhaps the ether was dragged along by the Earth. Perhaps objects contracted as they moved through it. Perhaps measuring rods shrunk in just the right amount to hide the effect. Explanations multiplied, each one more elaborate than the last, each one constructed to protect an assumption that no one wanted to question. The assumption that velocity always makes sense relative to something. G did not start from that experiment. Asterisk. I want to be clear about thought. He was not solving a puzzle produced by a dot. He was uncomfortable with something deeper. He was uncomfortable with an asymmetry in the laws themselves. A magnet moves past a coil of wire. A current is produced when the coil moves past a stationary magnet. A current is also produced. The observable result is the same, but the physical explanations were different depending on who was considered. D to be moving. That asymmetry offended math. Laws of physics should not change based on the accident of which object you decide to call stationary. That conviction was not experimental. It was almost aesthetic, and I followed it. I allowed myself to ask the question that others refused to ask seriously. What if the speed of light is not relative to anything? What if it is simply constant, same speed for everyone in every direction, no matter how fast they are moving? When I allowed that thought to exist without immediately destroying it, everything fell apart, and then everything rebuilt itself. If the speed of light is the same for everyone, then consider to observe a sun is standing still, is on a train moving at an enormous speed of less h of light happens in the middle of the train car. Light travels outward in all directions at the same speed for the observer on the train. The light reaches both ends of the car at the same time. The car is symmetric. The speed is constant. Timing is equal. No, the observer standing on the platform watches this same event. The train is moving. The back wall is rushing toward where the flash happen at front wall is rushing away from it. Light still moves at the same speed in both directions, but the back wall meets the light sooner. Front wall takes longer. For the person on the platform, the two flashes do not arrive at the same time. They are separate at-woe events that are simultaneous in one reference frame and not simultaneous in another. Stopping. About what that means, simultaneity is not real, not in the way we assume it. There is no single universal present moment that covers the entire universe. At-woe things can happen at the same time for one observer and at different times for another. Both are correct, neither is wrong. This was not a trick. This was not a limitation of measurement. This was the structure of reality, and it did not stop the if time behaves this way. Then time must be flexibly moving. Clock does not just appear to run slow, it runs slow. Ticks themselves are farther apart. This was confirmed eventually. With atomic clocks placed on airplanistic clocks on the planes came back slightly behind. The clocks on the ground, not because of vibration, not because of electromagnetic interference issues, they had moved. Time had passed more slowly for a few nanoseconds, but real measurably satellites in your navigation systems must account for this. Without the correction, the position errors would accumulate by kilometers each day. We built a technology on the assumption that time is flexible. Light works, and it is not only time. Space is also not fixed. An object in motion is shorter in the direction of its motion than when it is at rest, not because it is compressed by the airnet, because the atoms are rearranged. The distance itself is contracted. Space for a moving object is different from space for a stationary one. Length depends on velocity. Duration depends on velocity. Neither space nor time is a container that sits outside reality. They are part of reality. Alatian Vedaformi was forced to abandon the idea of absolute time. This is not a small thing to abandon. Tin's universe had a single clock ticking in the background. In universal, now in universal, the never known in the universe shared the same river of time. Even if they could not communicate with each other, that picture was comfortable. It matched intuition exactly. It was also not truth. There is no universal now. There are only local now. See a now, me now of something moving past us at high speed. Each one real, each one inconsistent with the other. Sand. Then there is the question of mass. When I followed the mathematics further, I found something I did not expect. Energy and mass are not different. Substance, they are the same. Substance are indifferent. Forms. The relationship is simply, almost embarrassingly simply, a small amount of mass corresponds to an enormous amount of energy. Factor that connects them is the speed of light squared. That number is very large. This is why a small piece of uranium can release energy sufficient to level a city's mass. Does not disappear, it converts. He did not invent this conversion. He discovered that it was already happening everywhere. The sun loses mass every second. The heat that reaches your face is the aftermath of mass becoming energy in the solar core. It has been doing this for billions of years. It will continue for billions more. But I must tell you something about light. Specifically, because light is stranger than time, dilation stronger than length, contraction strong than mass and energy. Light is the thing that broke my intuition most completely. A photon, a particle of light, has no rest mass. This is a strange statement. Rest mass is the mass an object has when it is sitting still, but a photon is never sitting still. It cannot be. Photon travels at the speed of light, and only light travels at the speed of light. Anything with mass cannot reach that speed. Anything with zero mass cannot travel at any other speed. Light does not choose to travel at that speed. It has no alternative. The photon's perspective, if we can even speak of such a thing. No time passes at all. A photon emitted from a distant galaxy billions of years ago arrives here, having experienced no duration whatsoever. The journey that took billions of years from the photon's frame of reference took no time. It left. It arrived in the same instant. There was no between. I do not know what to do with that even after all my years of thinking. I am not sure I understand it in any intuitive way. It is a consequence of the mathematics. Mathematics are consistent. Experiments confirm. But the image it creates inside the mind is not an image. It is an absence seen, yet light carries information. It carries the fact of things when you look at a star. You are not seeing the star, you are seeing light that left the star some time ago for the nearest stars. That is a few years for the stars at the edge of the visible universe. That is nearly 14 billion years. The universe we observe is a kind of fossil record layered in. Time farther you look, the older what you see. The most distant objects we can detect are showing us the universe when it was very young, when the first structures were condensing out of the initial chaos. We observe this not because we have time machines, but because light takes time to arrive, and light is the only way we can know anything about what is out there. But here is the thing that still troubles me, thing that I could not resolve. A quantum mechanics spent the second half of my life in disagreement with it, not because the mathematics were wrong, the mathematics were impeccable, but because of what it said about light, about photons, about the nature of reality. At the smallest scales, when light passes through to narrow slits, it creates a pattern on the other side, an interference pattern, the kind of pattern you get when waves overlap. Peak meets peak, trough meets trough. This is wave behavior. This confirms light is a wave, but when you reduce the intensity of the light so that only one photon passes through at a time, the pattern still builds so live a timion dot at a time. The individual photons arrive as particles, but the accumulation of where they land forms the same interference pattern as if each individual photon somehow passes through both slits simultaneously, as if each photon interferes with itself when you place a detector at the slits to find out which slit each photon actually passes through. The pattern disappears, becomes to simple bands. If the photon, knowing it is being watched, decides to behave like a particle, not using metaphor. This is what the experiment shows that of me. SURING changes the outcome, not because the detector bumps the photon, not because of any mechanical interference, but because of something we do not have a word for, something in the nature of quantum systems. I refused to accept this. I refuse to believe that reality is fundamentally undetermined until it is observed that a photon does not have a definite location or path until something interacts with it. He said, God does not play dice, meant that the universe must have a deeper reality. Beneath the probability sheet, the quantum randomness was a sign of our ignorance, not of genuine indeterminacy. Was wronger, at least. The experiments since my death have strongly suggested I was wrong. Bell's theorem, tested in laboratories decades after I died, showed that no hidden variable theory of the kind I imagined can reproduce all the predictions of quantum mechanics. Indeterminacy may be irreducible, fundulent, and in photon may genuinely not have a path until something forces it to have one. Do not like this conclusion. I still do not like it, but disliking a conclusion is not a valid argument against it. Reality has no obligation to be what I find comfortable, what I understand about light. After all this, it has a fixed speed. That fixed speed forced us to abandon absolute time, abandon absolute space. Discover that mass and energy are equivalent. That the universe we observe is always a view into the past, and then quantum mechanics added something else. See that the photon itself does not have definite properties until it is forced to have them. That its behavior before interaction is described only by probability. The act of knowing changes what is known. There is no model that satisfyingly contains all of this, not one that I found, not one that anyone has found, since quantum mechanics and general relativity are both extraordinarily accurate, both confirmed by experiment to a precision that is almost incomprehensible, and they are not fully consistent with each other. The scales where both should apply. The scales are very small things with very strong gravity. The equations break down, they give nonsense, and worse infinities where there should be number. Something is missing, something fundamental, something that was already missing when I was working. I knew it, then I spent the last 30 years of my life searching for it. Did not find it. Perhaps what is missing is a picture, not more equations, not more mathematics, but a way of seeing what the mathematics describe as a way of thinking about space and time and light and probability that does not collapse into contradiction when you hold it in the mind. Who have the numbers, who do not have the imagination. Keep returning to that question. From when I was 16, what would it look like to ride alongside? A beam of light, I answered it. In a way, it would not look like anything because time would not pass, because there would be no experience of looking, because looking requires ration requires time, and time for light. Is there a question cannot be answered from the inside out, can only be circled from the outside. A describate experience effort is where I leave it, not at a resolution, not at a final picture, the edge of what can be known. From where we stand, light is the fastest thing in the universe. It is also the limit of what the universe allows us to see. We are surrounded by it, would depend on it entirely for our knowledge of anything beyond this planet, and it contains, inside its behavior, a series of facts about reality that we still cannot fully hold together. The constancy of its speed dismantles time. Its wave nature produces interference. Its particle nature produces measurement effects we cannot explain classically. Its connection to mass through energy transforms matter into radiation and radiation into matter in the cores of stars, in particle accelerators, in the early universe, and when you push the mathematics far enough into the extreme of very small scales, the theory breaks, answers become infinite. Teth picture dissolve as I spend my life thinking about light. He found more than I expected. He understood less than I wanted. Tothet is not a comfortable place to end, but it is the honest one.